accent. But look, you've just been regaled with beautiful photographs that Marg takes. They're fantastic. I've got a bunch on my screensaver on my computer. And you've heard from Bronwyn about the incredible biodiversity of the Underwood Bushland. And I guess my job here is to talk a little bit about my area of expertise, and that's the economics of environment, the economics of environmental protection. Now those things might seem juxtaposed or contrary, but the plain truth is that the people who are in this room, all of us here, we're here because we already know the value of those creatures and the biodiversity that the two ladies who've gone before me have explained to you. We know how important it is for ourselves, for our families, to think that our kids are going to have a chance to continue to live with that kind of amazing biodiversity. But the plain fact of the matter is that around the world, the vast majority of people right now don't care. If they did, we wouldn't be facing the position that we are right now in Perth and globally, where biodiversity of all kinds is under massive threat. So just to change gears a little bit, I don't know if anyone's heard of the Living Planet Index, but it measures biodiversity around the planet and its health and its relative abundance. And it's an index that's been measured since 1970 across the world with the participation of organizations, governments, from all sides of the world. And what it shows is that since 1970, when the index started, global biodiversity has declined by about a third. That means that 1/3 of everything on the planet that isn't human has gone. In some biomes, like tropical forests, it's 55%, more than half. So if you put that in the context of that's the last 40 years, roughly 45 years, between 1970 and now. So a lifetime, half a lifetime maybe. Now look forward over the next 40 years to 2050 or so. And the population is going to increase from its current 7 billion to anywhere between 11 and 12 billion. So that means that over the next 35 years, we're going to add the equivalent of a city the size of Perth every week. Every week. And in this 21st century, all of those people demand more, because much of that population growth won't occur in developed countries like ours. It'll occur in Africa and Asia and so on, where the people are much poorer and have historically demanded a lot less from their environment than we have. We, in Australia and Canada and Europe and the United States, we have the highest footprint, ecological footprint on the planet. It's 100 times greater than somebody who lives in India or Africa. So that means we gobble up 100 times more of the natural environment to live the way we live than most of the other people do on this planet. And so to me, at a very personal level, the kind of discussion we're having today becomes even more poignant, because if we, with all of our intelligence and our great economy and our wealth and our education, can't find our way to save the last few remaining pockets of this beautiful diversity right in our own cities, how can we expect the poorest and the least educated on this planet to save their biodiversity, which, let's not forget, is also ours. We all share this planet. So, one of the things that I've been doing over the last 15 or 20 years of my career is I've been trying to focus on a different language to communicate this beauty and this wonder. And that's a very utilitarian language. It says, okay, it's nice. Okay, it looks great. But we continue to destroy it. Why? Because the vast majority of people in our society don't believe that it matters to them. They don't believe that it has any value to them in a very utilitarian sense, an economic sense. And yet when we start to delve into it, what we find is that not only are places like Underwood Bushland incredibly beautiful, not only do they stir the soul, but they are incredibly important. They provide services to us, humans, that can't be duplicated readily by ourselves. So, I'll give you an example. Bushland in Perth keeps the city cooler than it would have been. Significantly cooler. CSIRO has done major studies in places like Melbourne, where we found that the urban canopy, where present, can lower the average temperature of an urban area by 5 degrees in the hottest days of summer, and thereby significantly reduce mortality, especially in older people, people with infirmities, or the very young. So it actually has a direct relationship to human excess death. So not only do bushland areas keep our cities cooler and therefore reduce excess mortality, which is something that you can measure in dollar terms. Every life saved can be equated to dollars. That's just a life insurance thing. Actuarial science proves that. By the way, the average Canadian or Aussie is worth about $1 million, and the average American is worth about $1.5 million. I wonder why. But nonetheless, you can start to see how you can translate bushland into dollars. What else does it do for us? Well, we're living in a world whose climate is changing very rapidly. A lot of the science that we do in CSIRO, in my flagship, is focused on exactly that. It's predicting just how quickly the climate is going to change and what those effects will be and how we can adapt and protect ourselves against the changes that are coming. And one of them is to retain natural areas inside our urban landscapes. You may have remembered Superstorm Sandy, which hit New York. There's some beautiful studies coming out of the United States and New York right now that show that areas of the coastline where natural dunes and natural landscapes were retained were largely protected from the force of the hurricane. So the man-made structures, the buildings and the roads and everything that sat behind those natural structures were largely spared. But where we had developed and eliminated the natural systems, which are designed by nature to absorb the energy of those storms and survive, where we moved right to the seaboard, built concrete walls, everything behind there was razed to the ground. And so insurers are starting to see the value of these systems in helping us weather extreme events. Now, as climate change progresses, what you'll see is that extreme events are going to become more frequent, they're going to shift in pattern, and they're going to become more violent. So heat waves, storms, floods, high winds, cyclones, fires, you're going to get more of them, and they're going to be more damaging. Natural systems like bushland help to prevent and buffer those floods, storms, etc. Without them, we get damage. That damage has huge value. It's locked up in buildings and so on, and therefore you can start to translate and estimate the value in dollar terms of bushland. So the language that I've been trying to develop over the last decade or so in my writing and in my work at CSIRO and other places has been to try to convince the people who wouldn't fill this room, because they don't care about the birds and how beautiful it is, to understand that every time we lose bushland, we're actually losing the ability of our cities to protect themselves, and that has economic implications. Some work that I've done recently with some colleagues suggests that every hectare of bushland in the western suburbs, not only here, Kings Park, Old Park, etc., is worth anywhere between $750,000 and $1.5 million. Now that's not the value of the land itself. That's the value of that thin veneer of living infrastructure, if you want to call it, that grows in the soil and sits above the canopy. That ecosystem. And it's got value because it provides not only protection against extreme events, protection against floods, the cooling effect of our cities, but it's also a natural asset for the people who live there. So people like green spaces. Property value is considerably more if you're within a radius of a couple of miles of green space. Your same property is worth anywhere between 5 to 15% more than if you're in an area where you're just surrounded by concrete. Now, we all know that intrinsically, but it can be proven and shown both mathematically and economically. So in the end, what that means is that if you're a developer and you're allowed to raise all of that bushland, I keep pointing to these photos here, but if you're allowed to raise all that bushland, which belongs essentially to the people of the western suburbs and the people of the state, and you don't have to compensate us, the people, for that, we're giving the developer a free subsidy, equivalent to the value of that bushland. So how many hectares are we talking about? So if you're talking about 32, 33 hectares, then you're talking in the order of $50 to $60 million. Net present value, 30 years. More if you want to use a longer term of accrual, and more if you want to use a lower discount rate. I use a 3.5, but you could easily argue using a lower discount rate. That's technical, but what it means is you're talking in the tens of millions. So what that means is that around the world, the people of the planet, the people of Western Australia, the people of Perth, are in effect granting free subsidies, the right to pollute and the right to destroy the natural environment which belongs to all of us, and that those rights have huge value. And if we only captured a portion of that value and asked the developers, or demanded the developers, reimburse us for those losses, which is our due, you'd find that on the margin, which is where developers operate, they're only making slim margins in terms of profit. If that margin goes from 15% to 8 or 9, they're not going to bother. So it's really, really important, I believe, that people understand that there is value here, that it can be framed in dollar terms. And look, right now we don't have a legislative framework that allows governments to ask the private sector to compensate people for that. We started to do it with the carbon tax, if you think of it. Same thing, the free right to pour pollution into the atmosphere and not pay for that right to pollute. It's like saying, you come and dump all your waste in my yard, and you can do it for free, because it's cheaper for you than you driving it all the way to the dump. Just dump it in my yard, and I won't ask you to either clean it up or compensate me for it. I mean, who's that dumb, right? But as a society, that's what we're allowing. And so the future has to be pay as you play. If you want to pollute, and if you want to damage, and if you want to take away the assets that belong to the people, then you're going to need to pay for them. Now, I'll just make a final note. There's incredible value locked up here in terms of biodiversity. There isn't legislation right now that allows us to claim that back. But I have worked with private sector organizations around the world who have voluntarily understood these values and said, okay, I didn't know that was worth $50 or $60 million, that biodiversity. Now I know, and that's a lot of money. What I'll maybe try to do is find a different way to achieve my objectives without quite destroying quite so much of that value. Maybe as a good operator, as a good social citizen, I can find a way to do what I want to do without basically asking you people to subsidize me quite to that extent. And that becomes a basis for a negotiation and a discussion that can be termed and framed in a quantity that every single person in our society understands. Because everyone understands the value of a dollar. But very few people in our society right now, unfortunately, understand or even care about the value of a cockatoo or the kind of biodiversity that Robin was talking about. Thanks very much.